back everyone, thanks for joining us. Today we are going to start tearing down the M52 B28 BMW motor that came out of the E36. For today, the beginning of this, we're just going to tear it down and basically go through the motor and see what condition it's in. It has about 260 odd thousand, I think, somewhere around there, kilometers on the motor, so about 260,000 kilometers. It wasn't smoking when driving, but it did have a start-up smoke. So that's normally valve stem seals on these BMW engines, so let's get into it. Okay, so what we've done is organization with any engine teardown rebuild is key. So what I've done is I've used a very sophisticated system called boxing. I've just marked on the box, that's for the cylinder head. So all the little bolts, nuts, screws, everything, head studs, everything's going to pretty much go in here. It probably won't all fit in here, but it's a starting point. And then this is for the sub-assembly. Obviously, the crank is not going to fit in there, but we'll put the pistons and the rods separately in a different box, but this is effectively for all of the fasteners. All the big bits like the alternator that we'll keep separately, but just note when you're doing something like this, organization is key. So we're going to get started. Okay, so what Johannes is doing is he's making us a little tool that we can lock out the water pump pulley. We're just going to use one of my old C spanners for the springs and for setting rod height. And basically we just lock that out so we can get this fan off. So Johannes is going to just measure that up while we carry on. So what's interesting is I took this manifold off before, the front one. Now taking this one off, I can see that this manifold still has an exhaust gasket. This one didn't have an exhaust gasket on, which leads me to believe that this has been off before, which is kind of counter to what I thought. It looks like this cylinder head has never been off, but the exhaust has been off. So it's a bit of archaeology, but I was wrong. The gasket is still stuck to the exhaust header. So these are obviously the stock headers, but okay, I was wrong. So it looks like these have never been off, which is a good sign. Found me a little box. My God. So the story with this, with the inside here is much the same as what the car was. You can just see it's really dirty and old. The state of this intake manifold, this seems to be a common thing with these B28 motors. It's just a lot of corrosion and wear. So we'll clean all of this up, but it looks like it's all there, which is good. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm just taking all the old stuff off. These are the fuel lines, and this is the return line, and this is really old and perished, so we're going to replace them along with the clamps. We're just getting all the old gubbins off, and then the intake will come off, and then we'll get stuck into the rest of it. Alright, so we're just taking the fuel lines off, as I mentioned. So what happens is this line comes from the fuel pump, the high pressure fuel pump, which basically takes fuel, petrol, gasoline, whatever, out of the fuel tank and sends it down this line at a certain pressure, sometimes 5.56 bar. Don't know what that is in PSI, but it supplies the fuel along and basically pressurizes this whole stainless steel rail. Then this round thing here is called a fuel pressure regulator, and what that does is it basically manages the pressure inside this rail, and then whatever it doesn't use, it bleeds off through this line and sends it back to the fuel tank. So this fuel rail is pressurized, it's under pressure all the time. And what the engine control unit, the ECU, does is it is connected to all of your fuel injectors, and it basically activates the fuel injector, which just opens it so many times in a second. We call it duty cycle. And it opens and closes so many times, it creates this fuel vapor. And because the fuel in the rail is under pressure, as the injector opens, the fuel sprays into the combustion chamber, and that creates the correct environment for atomization. So obviously it goes into the combustion chamber. The engine control unit tells the coil, which is connected to the spark plug, when to switch on. The coil basically creates a spark when the fuel is in the combustion chamber, and the compression is at exactly the right situation, whatever, and that's what gives you your explosion, your heat expansion, which pushes the piston down, which connects to your crankshaft and turns directional energy into rotational energy. Okay, so I've taken a lot of the bits off at the bottom under the intake, disconnected the PCB valve, taken the throttle body off, a lot of the bits. We're now going to take the intake off. So let's see how well that goes. So you can see there's a whole bunch of gasket sealer on the valve cover gasket. And a common thing on these BMW engines, pretty much most of the BMW engines, is that the valve cover gasket leaks, as well as the rear main seal on the crankshaft, that leaks. So this was leaking, this rear main seal was leaking, the front seal was leaking, and that's just normal. That's maintenance stuff on a BMW engine. However, the quality of this engine looks really good. It looks like the cylinder head has never been off. I could be wrong, but from what I can see, the cylinder head gasket is still the original part. So that's encouraging news. It's just that it's a high mileage engine, but it looks like all the bits are still original, which is really good news. So doesn't look too bad. It's running rich, but that's just from moving it around. It's not caked up with oil, so that's a good sign. So looks like the engine wasn't in too bad condition. Good plugs as well from GKRs. So when you're removing the plugs, you always want to put them in order from the front of the engine, left to right, so that you know which cylinder is perhaps running badly. But these all look pretty good. So because someone used gasket sealer on the gasket here, the valve cover gasket, the valve cover is now stuck. So we have to be careful, because I think this valve cover gasket is magnesium, so we don't want to break it. So I'm going to try and work it with the Stanley knife. Just go through. Extremely painstaking process to break the gasket. We'll come back to you. Okay. It's crunch time. Oh man. a mark here on the crank pulley that says OT, which means on top. So what we're going to do is line that up with this mark here, and that'll effectively get the engine up to top dead center. Still good compression. So that in theory should be at TDC. So then you get a cam timing tool, which I don't have yet, I'm still going to get it. But effectively the tool sits on the back of the cams here and locks these cams into place. That's when you're doing the cam timing. We don't need it now because we're stripping everything. But it looks like these cams are more or less in the right location, so everything looks kind of good. The motor's at TDC and we're going to start stripping everything apart. Alright, so we've just taken the belt off. Listen here. So, alternator bearings are sounding a bit old, but this idler pulley is definitely old. Water pump's still alright, but we'll see as we take everything apart. So what I'm doing now is I'm loosening the Vanos oil supply line. Then we're going to take this bracket off and we're going to basically loosen up the cam timing, the cam chain, take off the Vanos so we can get ready to take the head off. It looks like something was leaking at the back here. Not sure what it was. But this is definitely going to leak oil out. Someone tried to put sealer on here. It's very bad. When in actual fact, all it is these two washers. These two washers inherently leak. And it's like, what? Not even $1 or 10 Rand. So you can see this is a common failure on these BMW engines. And you can see someone's used gasket sealer here again. And this seal is very hard, it's rock hard. So I can understand why it's leaking, but to use gasket sealer here with all these oil galleries is very bad. So who knows how much of this has gone into the engine. Pressure relief is still working. Look at all the wear on the surface. You can see there is an indentation here. You can see on the sides as well. This is a very old tensioner, possibly the original. Wow. Pretty wild. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the cams out first before we take the head off, so that the valves are closed inside the head, because there's a bunch of other things we're going to do. So yeah, I'm gonna just take the cams out. What you need to do when you loosen up a cam, especially a cam that's quite long, is you need to loosen up the caps. Loosen the caps off quite evenly so that you don't kind of do that, because then the cam, because it is cast iron or cast steel, it can snap, and that's how people break cams, especially when they're tightening them down. So you loosen it off evenly, specifically with a focus on where the cam is pushing the valves down. Okay, so when you take the cap off, just always look for score marks on there, and you can feel almost with the nail of your finger. So this one has a little bit of pickup on this journal, but it's very light, so that's pretty much fine. That one is good. So even though the motor is really dirty, these are key things you look at. That's fine. A little bit of wear. I've seen motors with extremely high wear on the cam journals, and they still run them with modified cams, and they work. Luckily these are hydraulic lifters, because otherwise we'd be resetting shims. So these are the hydraulic lifters. These have got little seats and springs inside, and they're fed with hydraulic oil, which is basically the engine oil under pressure. What that does is it takes up the clearance between the camshaft and the actual top of the valve. So this sits on top of the valve. There you can see the shiny part where it rides on the valve, and it takes up the clearance between the cam, basically the gap between the cam and the actual valve. And in race motors, what you do is you set this with mechanical spacers, basically little spacers. The problem with that is, as the motor wears, as the valve seat wears and the valve lifts up in the motor, the clearance gets closer, and you have to basically re-clearance it. But with a hydraulic lifter, it's automatic. It's also a lot quieter, and so that's why on standard production cars, hydraulic lifters are a very common thing. Now with the cams we're going to use in this motor, it's effectively going to be the M3 spec, E36 M3 spec cams. We can still use these hydraulic lifters, so massive win. So it looks like everything is loose, and we're about to take the cylinder head off, so just give it a bit of persuasion. It's the first time this thing's been off in 26 years, probably close to 27, 28 years, hopefully. We're going to see now. So you can see by the carbon buildup, this engine was burning a bit of oil. It's not really that clean on the valve, so was definitely burning oil. But the good news is that the head looks good. You can still see the hone marks. If we look at the walls of this block, this is an aluminium block, so a lot of the M52 B28 motors, the single vane-os motors, came with aluminium blocks with Nickel barrels. Some of the American versions later came with steel liners. This one doesn't have steel liners. This one is nickel. So we'll have to take it to the machine shop and see whether the bore is still okay, and if we can give it a hone. There's a couple of small marks, but it's nothing really bad from what I can see. So it'll be interesting to see what the pistons look like. So you'll always have a little bit of play in the top of the piston. So you can't, just by rocking the piston like this, you can't gauge the wear. You have to literally take it out. But what you don't want is play like that, because that means the bearing has failed. On the face of it, it looks good, but I'll need to take it to the machine shop for them to actually see. Worst case scenario, we're going to have to re-sleeve this block. Hopefully we don't have to do that. Nice! What? Look at that. This is amongst the worst I've seen. Alright, let's take the pistons out. Look at that. Some wear on the bearing. Not much, but that's a BMW thing. Very common BMW. There's no friction on the actual ball. Like with new rings, you really battle to lift the piston up and down. But this is like almost just falling out. Come on, yeah? There we go. So similar kind of wear. Original bearings. And the bearings still look good considering the age of them. The actual piston, lots of wear on the skirt, but no scoring. That's a good sign. Very interesting because of the nickel. But you can see that there's been a lot of blow by. So I think the rings are just worn out. But the condition of the piston is pretty good. Overall, it looks good. It's, you know, it's understandable for such a high mileage motor, and you can see the motor, they didn't change the oil that often, so it's actually pretty good. Alright, so that's going to be a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. This engine was absolutely in pretty bad shape in terms of cleanliness, but in terms of wear and tear, it's pretty good. So we've got a lot of work to do on it. But it's just part of the process. From here, what's standing in front of me is pretty amazing. That's going to be in the next episode. If you follow my Instagram, you'll already know what that is, but stay tuned for that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you guys next time. See ya.